I'd like to thank Ed Corrigan and the group of which he's a part for their hospitality and kindness, and to thank Ed as well for the fine work that he's done over many years in human rights work, in solidarity with Palestine, and his work also professionally as a refugee lawyer and a scholar of law in that area. Now, I think I'd like to begin by repeating a few words that I wrote in a review of a very interesting recent collection of poetry by Ehab Loteyev entitled "To Love a Palestinian Woman." I wrote that the politicians of Canada's ruling parties may express a pious commitment to international human rights law, but their actions show how feebly selective, in fact, this commitment is. Our leader's message to the Palestinian people is that of Franz Kafka's jurists in his novel The Trial. There is justice, plenty of justice, only not for you. Franz Kafka is the great writer of, I suppose, the great predictor of the totalitarian regimes of the 20th century. He died in the 1920s. Now, I'm going to be telling you some stories this evening, stories that I hope will converge in an interesting way, that will bring together a number of perhaps apparently disparate motifs. One of these motifs is that of neo-McCarthyism. Now, when we say neo-McCarthyism, we're remembering that repulsive American senator, Joseph McCarthy, who in the early 1950s conducted an anti-communist scare campaign, standing up in public saying, "I have in my hands a list of 100, 200, the number kept growing and changing, subversives in whatever American institution you wanted to imagine." We are witnessing today in two countries, and I'll name them, one is Israel, one is Canada, a neo-McCarthyite campaign of scaremongering and moral panic. And we're witnessing as well in both countries a concomitant erosion of civil liberties. And that, of course, should be of particular concern to us here, in part because the erosion of civil liberties in this country is linked to a doctrine of fanaticism on the part of our current Prime Minister and his cabinet. I say fanaticism advisedly because I think it is fanatical for the Prime Minister of a democratic country to stand up, as Prime Minister Harper did in early November in the House of Commons in Ottawa, at a meeting organized by this Canadian Parliamentary Coalition to Combat Antisemitism, and to say that he's ready to pay any price in defense of a foreign state, State of Israel, rather than perhaps more properly attending to the interests of the country of which he is Prime Minister. Now, as I suggested in that initial quotation from my review of Ehab Loteyev's very interesting book, underlying what I say tonight will be the question of justice for Palestine. And in relation to that question, the subject of Canada's complicity in supporting a regime of increasing oppressiveness in the occupied Palestinian territories and within Israel itself. Whereas, I'm sure you know, the 20% of Israeli citizens who are not Jewish are subject to various kinds of legally implanted discrimination. I will be talking about what may seem some slightly arcane subjects, the so-called new anti-Semitism, which I want to propose to you is an entirely fraudulent category, and something mysteriously called lawfare. I will have some things to say about two contemporary Canadian politicians in particular, former Justice Minister and Professor Emeritus of Law at McGill University, Irwin Cotler, and our present Minister of Citizenship, Immigration and Multiculturalism, Jason Kenney. Now, I think one place to begin is perhaps with cries for help that have been coming to the world from within the State of Israel. What kinds of cries for help? Well, cries of alarm and anxiety over what well-qualified and distinguished Israelis are identifying as a very serious potential for the destruction of what remains of Israeli democracy. Let me quote to you from the Israeli newspaper Haaretz some words by Daniel Blattman. Professor Daniel Blattman is a Holocaust scholar. He's director of Hebrew University's Avram Harman Institute of Contemporary Jewry. He's a very distinguished Israeli scholar. And the subject of this essay, appearing in the newspaper Haaretz, or the title of his essay, is 1932 is Already Here. Now that's an interesting title, because what it of course evokes, inevitably, is the history of Weimar Germany in the period immediately before the rise, or at least the coming to power, of Adolf Hitler in 1933. Now that sounds a lot like a taboo subject, doesn't it? I mean, if one suggests that there are analogies to be made of any kind between contemporary Israel and Nazi Germany, one is treading on very thin ice. And yet here is a distinguished Israeli scholar raising this analogy. He says, in the Israel of today, I quote, "We can observe quite a few conditions whose presence in other societies and among other peoples led to racial separation, ethnic cleansing, and even genocide. There are minority groups in Israel," he says, Arabs and foreigners, quote, "who are ostracized by the majority. A growing racist ideology attempts to limit the political activities and civil rights of the minority, a tense security situation, and strong political elements with vested interests in territorial expansion." Now, without saying so explicitly, what he's offering is an extended analogy between the state of Germany at a period of very serious crisis that led to catastrophe, and what he understands the contemporary situation of his own country to be. Now, I call that a kind of cry for help because I think what he is saying is that his country is drifting intransigently into not merely a condition of crisis, but a condition of catastrophe. And here, also from the newspaper Haaretz, are some words from an editorial addressed to the President of Israel, Shimon Peres, saying, "Mr. President," this is the title, "you must fight Israel's mounting racism." The editors of Haaretz write, "The fire of hatred and racism is ablaze in Israel. Signs of loathing toward Arab citizens and African migrants are cropping up every day. Examples include the municipal rabbi's letter that called for a ban on renting or selling homes to non-Jews, the protest rally for Jewish Bat Yam. Bat Yam is an Israeli city, and the protest rally was conducted by a group called Lehara, which is an acronym for Preventing Assimilation in the Holy Land. The activists in this group appear to be former activists within the banned terrorist and racist party Kach, which was founded by the terrorist and racist Rabbi Kahane.